Alright guys, what's up? It's Jack and welcome back to another video. And this one has been a long time coming, except it's not going to be with the editing prowess that my Donkey Kong Country original retrospective video was. However, I think it's time we talk about Donkey Kong Country 2. And yes, I'm going to start right away with the commentary to state that yes, I do believe overall that Donkey Kong Country 2 indeed surpasses the original. In my mind, in terms of nostalgia and in terms of the kind of feelings both games give me, they're pretty much neck and neck. But when you're looking at it from a pure gameplay standpoint and how it managed to do the impossible, but by capturing lightning in a bottle twice, and on top of that, improving in just about every aspect that the original gave, yeah, you have to give your flowers to Donkey Kong Country 2. Now, obviously, when starting the game, you have to realize that the pirate theme really hit home with this game, right? But when you're talking about gameplay, it pretty much improved on what Donkey Kong Country had set out to begin with. Obviously, the developers really didn't have to worry about the engine because that was already established and worked for in the first game. So now it was about refining and perfecting literally every aspect of the original game. And I believe that they managed to do that in Donkey Kong Country 2. The game somehow, despite the fact that it was on the same system and it came out, like a year later or something like that, despite all that, the game still looked as good as, it looked even better than the original, just very slightly but noticeable, especially when you're looking at some of the backgrounds in certain levels of gameplay. In some aspects, the game looked noticeably better, but both games looked terrific, obviously. They used the same technique in order to make the characters in the world look the way they did and everything, but despite that fact, it just looked a little bit more polished in the second game, right? And when you're looking at gameplay, in terms of the different kind of animals that you could use in the game and the way that those operated, the subtle difference, or should I say not so subtle difference, when you're using Diddy's girlfriend as opposed to Donkey, it's a very big difference, but a welcomed difference because she could spin glide, if that's what the move is called. So that opens up a plethora of different ways to engage in different situations, to dodge enemies, etc., etc. And I think the developers realized that a lot of players, especially for those that were doing speed runs, would more often than not play as Diddy. I remember that even though I loved playing as Donkey, for me, Diddy was just overall better because he had that cartwheel and he was smaller in size, he was faster, and that basically made it to where, you could dodge, going in between enemies in midair a little bit easier than you would with Donkey because he was larger. So you guys get it, right? Overall, from a gameplay standpoint, Diddy was just more fun to use and more ease of access and faster, etc., in ways that Donkey was not. But with that being said, they kind of went a similar route to where they brought in Diddy's girlfriend, and she was, a little bit bigger because of the large ponytail or whatnot, but she could glide. You know what I'm saying? So that just opened up so many different ways in terms of how you can approach situations in the game. And on top of that, they really maximized the platforming aspects, not just in the ways with the barrels and everything else like that was apparent in the original game, which they obviously brought back here. But we're talking about different ways to where you can float in midair because, there was air that you could control, whether or not you could go up or down, in terms of how you would make that work. They managed to do so many different things that absolutely enhanced the gameplay, including one or two more different kinds of collectibles that you could do. There was like one really big coin that was hidden in every single level, and you really had to look for it. And it wasn't in plain sight all the time either. It wasn't like just jump extremely high and you'll see it up there. Sometimes you had to go below deck on a certain level. Sometimes you had to risk, falling off the level in order to do so. Sometimes you had to time specific jumps right. There was so many different ways that they did it. And you're talking about a side-scrolling platformer. This is not a 3D platformer. It is, obviously the game looks 3D because of the artwork that the original brought to the table that made it so unique from a visual standpoint. But in terms of gameplay, it was pretty much a full 3D game. 2D game. And that was a really, really big accomplishment back in the mid 90s when this game was released. And obviously in 1994 when Donkey Kong Country 1 was released. It was a really, really big deal. And for this game to just maximize upon everything that the first game had managed to set up, I mean, you can't really take away the flowers from Donkey Kong Country 2. Some people to this day would say that Donkey Kong Country 2 is arguably the greatest platformer of all time. Now, I don't know if I want to go that far, but I do in essence want to say that I completely understand why some people would say so. And I guarantee you that most of those people are around my age when we were young kids, when we got a hold of this game and we just realized how amazing it actually was. And I don't disagree with that one bit, but I still, you know, there's certain games throughout time that you really can't take away their flowers from either, right? But at the same time, you can't really penalize Donkey Kong Country 2 or Donkey Kong Country 1 for that matter either, because those games came out at a certain time and you have to grade the game of the kind of impact it had of its time relative to that time, right? You can't, because obviously you can't compare, you know, Donkey Kong Country 2 to like what some of the great platforming games that came out, let's say a handful of years later after that, or somewhere around there, right? You know, because when 3D gameplay came into play with, like, let's say a Mario 64 or a Zelda, right, Ocarina of Time, you know, you really can't make those comparisons. However, when you're looking at impact and relative to that time, there's a strong argument to be made for, like, let's say a Donkey Kong Country 2 versus a Mario 64, right? Now, both of those games are absolutely legendary in their own right, but in terms of the kind of impact that they had at the time when they came out for their respective consoles, there's a legit argument to be made on both sides. You know, you could take the limitations of every console and take those into consideration, the strengths and weaknesses on both sides and stuff like that, and there would still be a strong argument to be made. This is one of the reasons why Donkey Kong Country 2 and the games of its time that had the kind of impact that they had during those times are as good as they are. And that's why they're still talked about to this day, especially when you're talking to people that are around my age, at age 40, when we were literally in single digit age, you know, or if not, you know, double digit, in our very early double digits in age when this game came out. When Donkey Kong Country 1 came out, I was 10, I think, and then I was 11 when Donkey Kong Country 2 came out. So you really, when you look at it in that kind of perspective, and when that game sticks with you throughout time like that, and you'll never forget it, and when it's always going to be arguably in your top 10, in terms of not just greatest SNES games, but in greatest platformers ever developed, that speaks volumes. And you really can't take anything away from an accomplishment like that. So overall, in my opinion, in almost every single way, I mean, pretty much the only thing that Donkey Kong Country 2 overall that I can think of off the top of my head doesn't have over Donkey Kong Country 1 was the fact that Donkey Kong Country 1 was the original and was more than just a blueprint. It wasn't like Donkey Kong Country 1 was a tech demo and Donkey Kong Country 2 blew it out of the water. It's not like a Mortal Kombat 1 versus Mortal Kombat 2. Donkey Kong Country 1, respectfully speaking, is actually very close to Donkey Kong Country 2. But it's those differences in terms of how the game was refined and perfected, since there wasn't that much focus to be put on the engine anymore, since they didn't have to build the game from scratch anymore. That is what allowed the developers to literally perfect the game and really go all out. Like, I mean, can you guys imagine if they were actually given extra development time and what we got in Donkey Kong Country 2 with Donkey Kong Country 1? That would probably make the game undisputed in terms of what the greatest Super Nintendo game of all time ever was. But then, of course, you've got other games out there that exist, such as a Super Metroid, that are in the argument for that, or like, let's say, another game like Chrono Trigger or a Castlevania, right? Which I think it was Castlevania 4, if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, there's a reason why these games are echoed throughout time, and absolutely, positively, without a shadow of a doubt, Donkey Kong Country 2, I don't know where I would place it in a top 10 overall, because especially since it keeps on going back and forth between Donkey Kong Country 1 and Donkey Kong Country 2 to me for very personal reasons. But in terms of where I would place it among some of the greatest Super Nintendo games ever made throughout time, not only is it a top 10, but it is up there. Like, it is up there. It's one of those discussions to where I would frequently change my placement from one to the next, you know, going back and forth. But then, you know, when you start thinking about some of these other games, it's like, well, it's really, really hard to put any of those games in a certain placement over top 10, because every single one of those games, like a few of the ones that I mentioned about a minute or so ago, those are worthy of a potential number one greatest of all time. So with that being said, guys, I want to know in the comment section, do you guys believe, like in your heart, I mean, do you think that Donkey Kong Country 2 overall beats Donkey Kong Country 1? Now, obviously from a legacy perspective, that's a tough call, believe it or not, because, you know, you can't really take away from what Donkey Kong Country put on the map in gaming in general, right? Which is something that Donkey Kong Country didn't do, because DKC 1 allowed DKC 2 to do what it did, because it literally created everything. And like I said, it wasn't like a tech demo like it was for Mortal Kombat 1, Mortal Kombat 2. DKC 1, from a technical perspective, is pretty much just about right up there with DKC 2. But with that being said, where do you guys place DKC 2 in your personal top 10 greatest Super Nintendo games of all time, as well as just overall in terms of what it's done in platforming in general? I would probably put Donkey Kong Country 2 in my top 10 personal greatest platformers ever. And yes, Donkey Kong Country 1 would also be on that list. But Donkey Kong Country 2, even though there's a few things that it did that were definitely better, that made all the difference in the world, even though those things were a combination of minor things that actually ended up being better, overall greater when you add them up, I can't take Donkey Kong Country 1 away either, honestly. It's just one of those things for me. But with that being said, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say in the comment section below, as well as what game of the time in the SNES days would you consider to be the greatest ever? I'm probably expecting I'm expecting a lot of people to say Chrono Trigger, but we'll see. We'll see what people have to say. Super Mario RPG is up there for a lot of people as well as a few other games. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say, or reading in this case of what you guys have to say in the comment section below. So with that being said, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to watch and or listen. I'm looking forward to your comments, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.